The Smell of Cherries by Jeffrey Goddin. Taylor had never been in the Army. Too young for Korea, he'd pulled a high draft number and missed the Vietnam shindig. But he liked guns, and he liked excitement of the low-key variety. This might explain why he still found security work mildly interesting, even though he'd almost had his car shot up on an industrial espionage job and had had to wrestle a coked-out robber to the floor on a pawn shop beat. The problem with Taylor was he was a romantic and more or less incapable of taking orders from anyone on an 8-hour basis. This was probably the reason why what he'd regarded as merely a stopgap job on the way to better things was now heading into its second year. Now, near midnight, driving down a narrow river road on the Indiana side of the Ohio River across from Louisville, he was humming softly to himself. He looked forward to a night of sipping spiced coffee and watching the perimeter of a small trucking company for intruders. This was a holiday job. Happy Thanksgiving. He'd never done the Coleman trucking shift before. All he knew was that they had trouble keeping guards around. The guards got spooked for some reason. This, too, made the shift mildly attractive. The lights of Jeffersonville were fading in the distance. Night closed in around the inverted cones of his headlights. Dark November trees lined the road, with now and again a car parked by the roadside, interior lights on, kids smoking dope or drinking with the radio throbbing. Nice, calm, dark road. But Taylor had a slight uneasiness this night, a new feeling, as if in some way he were going into battle, and a part of him liked the feeling. He passed a stretch of river, distant lights, then the road ran back inland. Now on the left a series of large buildings came up, set well away from the road. A few of the buildings, but only a few, showed light. Taylor remembered that Coleman's lay along the edge of a large World War II military base, now mostly empty barrack space, a seldom-used proving ground with a skeletal maintenance staff. Almost there. He saw the red eyes of the reflectors marking the entrance to the wide staging lot. A dozen or so trailers ranged around the perimeter waiting for drivers. At the rear of the lot, he recognized the old El Camino of the day guard, Eddie Brewster. He and Eddie had wound up on the same jobs more than once. On a whim, he killed his lights. He accelerated a little, then let the car coast up beside the El Camino, which was facing to the rear of the lot. It was one of those minor precognitions, like when he'd known that the next guy to walk into the pawn shop was the one that he'd have to deal with. He'd also known in some strange fashion that the duty guard in the El Camino would be sleeping, and he was right. The driver's head was thrown back, a cap pulled across his eyes. Taylor rolled down his window, smelled the cool country air, a scent of dead leaves and earth. He was tempted to blow his horn to wake the shift cop, but he didn't. Funny, the man was talking to himself in his sleep. In the half-light, half-shadow of the interior, his face was contorted. He was agitated and talking rapidly. Then suddenly, he screamed. The man's eyes shot open. Immediately, he saw Taylor, and his hand was halfway to the gun on his seat when he recognized him. "Snuck up on me, you jerk!" "Any kid could have. It's a wonder you still have tires. Must have been some dream you were having." Brewster laughed a nervous laugh. "Hope I don't have any more like it. Dreamed I was sitting right here in my hillbilly Cadillac and some freaking monsters were creeping up on me out of the woods over there." Inadvertently, Taylor looked over to the wooded perimeter. A full moon made the nearer trees stand out starkly, dark shadows beneath. He could almost see things moving in there. "Of course, you're the one they're waiting for." Taylor shook his head. "Your sense of humor hasn't improved since the GE job, leaving that dead cat by the first key stop." "Hey, it gets better." Brewster consulted his watch. "Damn past midnight. Got a haul. My mom is waiting." "One thing," said Taylor, reaching for the walkie-talkie that Brewster handed him through the window. "I hear they have trouble keeping people on this shift. Why?" "Tails getting you? Hell if I know. As far as action goes, don't think anybody ever tried to hit this place. Nice and quiet and dead dull, out in the sticks like this. Maybe that's it. City boys get lonesome. See ya." Brewster slammed the Camino into low, shot gravel across the lot as he took off. Taylor watched the red taillights wink at the turn and disappear up the road toward Jeffersonville. The beginning of a 12-hour shift. A good time, as far as Taylor was concerned. He climbed out of the car, stretched, pulled out his shotgun, and walked across the loose gravel to the perimeter at the back of the lot. To the left, the woods. To his rear, the road. Ahead was an empty field of autumn weeds with a few desultory crickets chiming under the full moon and, very far away it seemed, the nearest of the abandoned barracks. The night was quiet, so still. He took a deep breath of cool air, turned around. He could see his old Chevy quite clearly in the moonlight. Something was standing beside it. Taylor's nerves froze. He was an experienced guard. He had a 12-gauge automatic shotgun with deer slugs under his arm. Yet there was something about the tall, apparently male figure beside his car that made him dizzy with fear, and there was only one thing to do about it. He began to walk slowly back across the lot, the shotgun in his hands. It seemed to take a very long time. With each step, the figure was slightly clearer. It was a man, bareheaded, wearing a long, loose coat, facing away from Taylor, peering into the car. Taylor suddenly remembered that, like an idiot, he had left the keys in the ignition. All this dude had to do was climb in and drive away. He began to run, holding the shotgun across his chest. He was quite close. The man must hear him, but he didn't move. 15, 10 yards. Taylor slowed to a walk and brought the gun up in one hand, his flashlight in the other. "You, don't move," he yelled. The figure didn't move. 5 yards, 4, 3. He pushed the switch on the flashlight and shined the beam full on the man, who had his hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched into an old khaki raincoat, a bald spot in the top of his head. "Take your hands out of your pockets real slow and turn around." Slowly, the figure took his hands out of his pockets. The bare fingers that protruded from the ends of the overcoat seemed very slender, very pale. It turned around, and Taylor shone his flashlight into its face. He didn't scream, but he wanted to. The man had no face. Taylor stood frozen, motionless. The man was gone. There was only a faint, sweetish smell in the air. "Base calling 2101. Base calling 2101. Taylor jerked open the car door and collapsed in the front seat. He fumbled at the leather-cased walkie-talkie. 2101 receiving. "Everything 10-2 down on the ranch?" said a fairly young female voice with a business-like edge. "Got a spook here, otherwise 10-2. "Copy?" "Spook. S-P-O-O-K. But harmless. Everything 10-2. "Lay off the funny cigarettes, 2101. But the switchboard girl giggled. 10-4. 2101 over and out. He put down the walkie-talkie. What the hell had he seen? He'd never seen anything like it before, even when he'd dropped acid a few times. Was his psyche gunning for him? He tried to put the thought out of his mind. It was a nice night, no wind, not too cold. He turned on the radio low, uncorked the old thermos, and had his first sip of the sweet, steaming coffee he'd made just before he left for the job. The moon was just touching the tops of the slender black trees. The paired lights of a car passed in the distance on the old 2-lane. It would be a good night, now that his unconscious had had its little fling. Taylor had a game he played with himself on long security shifts. He'd either mentally write the novel he'd promised himself he owed the world one day, or he'd reminisce about old girlfriends. The girlfriends generally came a bit more toward the early morning hours. He decided to pick up on the novel. The last time, he'd had his protagonist traveling across Ohio in a drunken haze. Now he would stop in a small Pennsylvania town and meet a lonely woman who ran a rooming house. She would be in her early 30s, pale, divorced, and pretty. She would invite him to dinner one night. Outside, the rain would be falling softly. Inside, the candlelight danced across her face, softening its lines. A sound interrupted his mental narrative. His preconscious heard the sound and registered it before his conscious mind. His conscious mind didn't want anything to do with it. Distant, but not too distant, the sound of a woman crying in pain. He scanned the lot. The moon rode high, the small floods illuminating the terminal building. The sound seemed to be coming from the far right rear of the perimeter, where a few trailers were parked. This is weird, but it is not as weird as it seems. Taylor climbed out of the car, taking the shotgun and flashlight. He walked quickly across the lot, the sound of his boots crunching gravel loud in the night. It came again, the cry, louder, a catch of horrible pain in the woman's voice. Taylor began to run. The sound seemed to be coming from directly behind the line of 4 trailers at the edge of the lot. Instead of running between the trailers into the darkness, he slowed and went around them to the left. The moonlight was bright and clear. It seemed as if the icy white moon were chilling the air. Narrow black shadows extended behind the trailers, but nothing moved in the shadows. Taylor stopped to catch his breath. The cry came again, piercing, agonized. A young woman's voice. It sounded as if she were dying horribly. Beyond the edge of the lot, there was a big stand of dry cattails, perhaps 10 or 15 yards deep, indicating swampy ground. Taylor walked cautiously toward them, and as he walked, he began to smell a faint, sweetish scent, not of the swamp. He almost did not go on, for it was the same scent he had smelled when he'd seen the faceless man by his car. But that was insane. The cry had subsided to a horrible gasping sob. Carefully placing his feet in the soggy ground, he flipped on his flashlight and pressed through the dry, rustling cattails. There was a small clearing in the center of the cattails. Here he saw a pool of water a few yards across. and lying half in the greenish-black pool was the corpse of a young woman, a pale, mottled, decayed thing whose long fair hair was entangled in the weeds and whose hands still clutched something long and dull and metal that had plunged into its chest. He shuddered, the light shaking in his hands, the odd, sweet smell very strong. This thing could have made no sound. Even as he watched, the corpse slowly sat up in the stagnant water, and the eyes rolled open and flashed moonlight into his. As though he were suddenly two people, he heard his own scream. The shotgun roared in his hand, and he slipped and staggered backwards. He got his balance and crashed through the cattails back to the paved lot, wiping frantically at bits of moist something that the blast had splashed across his face and clothes. He stood in the open, panting, looking back, terrified that the thing would follow him. The smoke of the shotgun blast still hung low over the swampy patch of cattails. There was no sound. He forced himself to turn around and walk slowly back to his car. The walkie-talkie was calling. Taylor picked it up gratefully, anxious for the human voice. "See any more spooks, 2101? Silence. 2101, copy. No, base. No more spooks. Everything 10-2. You kind of sound like one, 2101. Base out. 10-2, 2101 out. Taylor turned his car so he faced the terminal and had the swamp to his left, the lot entrance to his right. His back was to the woods, but at the moment he wasn't worried about anything that might come out of the woods. His hands were still shaking. He poured himself half a cup of coffee and filled it with old charter bourbon from the pint he kept under the seat. The bourbon felt nice and warm going down. Slowly, he began to relax. He tried to consider the things he'd seen tonight in a calm, rational manner. There were really only three alternatives. The most likely was that someone was playing tricks on him. Elaborate tricks, to be sure, but it was possible. The second possibility was that his own mind was playing tricks on him. But why now? Tonight? Why not at the LSD parties of the old days when he'd sat cool, calm, and collected while everyone else was freaking their heads off? No, that was out. He was not an unstable person. The third alternative was that there were spooks out there. No, no, and no. Taylor was romantic, but he didn't believe in spooks in any way, shape, or form. He raised the doctored coffee to his lips, savoring the aged bourbon. Suddenly it came to him. It was really very simple. They had trouble keeping guards out here before. A few had been told crazy stories, but management would have put that down to boozing on the job. Someone was going to a lot of trouble to scare the guards off. He knew that there were hot loads, booze, or electronics here occasionally. It was one thing to tackle an armed guard, but if you could just scare him off with some Dark Shadows routine, the rest would be a piece of cake. He turned and scanned the woods to the rear of the lot. Was someone in there watching him, even now, waiting to get into the trailers? It wasn't going to happen. He finished his coffee and decided to take another walk back around the perimeter. Suddenly, bright light filled the car. Someone was turning in off the river road. The big Ford Galaxy passed him, heading for the side door of the terminal. Taylor was halfway across the lot when a tall man in a light-colored suede jacket and western hat climbed out. "Don't shoot," he said. "I got a piss like a racehorse." "Sorry, this place is... It's okay. Name's Stahl. Day dispatch here. Yours is Taylor, right?" He produced a ring of keys from his pocket and proceeded to open the door. "Why don't you come in for a minute? Just don't drop the cannon. Browning auto, isn't it? Good deer gun. Close up." Taylor followed the big man into a narrow paneled room with a half window like a doctor's office where truckers picked up their loading bills and logged in. Stahl took off his jacket and put a tin on an old 2-burner hot plate for coffee, then plugged in the large electric heater by the beat-up wooden desk. Taylor pulled the chair up close to the noisy heater. It felt good. He hadn't realized he was shivering a little. Stahl disappeared behind a door marked private and returned a few moments later, zipping up his trousers. In the light of a couple bare bulbs, he looked older. Taylor placed his age at around 60. "So, you're the new replacement guard," said Stahl, half to himself. "Nope, I've got a regular beat across the river, pawn shops and trucking, but they needed somebody for the holidays." Stahl shifted a pile of papers on his desk, spooned instant coffee into a couple of cups, poured in the steaming water, and handed a cup to Taylor. "Well, hope you enjoy yourself out there. They kind of have a hard time keeping guards here." Taylor had a brief suspicion that Stahl might know something about the tricks someone was playing, but looking into the brown, lined face, he thought not. "Spooks, probably," said Taylor. "This is kind of a weird spot, what with the old barracks and all. Wouldn't be surprised if someone might try a few tricks to scare a guard off." Stahl's eyes narrowed, his nose twitching above his close-trimmed gray mustache, as if he might sneeze. "You seen something?" Taylor smiled. "Thought I did see something, but it turned out I was wrong." Stahl sipped his coffee, watching Taylor closely. "You haven't heard the history of this place, have you?" "Only that it was once part of a military base." Stahl smiled, almost mischievously. Well, there's a bit more to it than that. This was a real active base, on around World War II. Had 3,000 men in training at a time. They'd work 'em up, outfit 'em, and send 'em down to Fort Knox, Kentucky to fly out for parts unknown. I've lived around the valley all my life. Soldiers used to come into town on the weekends, raise holy hell, but we liked 'em. Stahl paused, eyes distant. But part of the history of this place is a little darker. Between World War II and Korea, they brought in some scientists, chemists, top secret, hush-hush kind of thing. We'd see 'em around town sometimes, but they were a pretty close-mouthed bunch. Wouldn't say what they were up to. They had a little factory, looked like maybe 50 people working there, set right where the terminal is now. But nobody, I mean nobody, knew what they were making in there. Most of us in town thought they were making some new kind of rocket, missile, or some such. Well, one morning, early, Country Sheriff Old Thompson has been out checking on a burglary out in River Road. He's driving by here, and somebody almost walks in front of his car. He yells at the guy, thinks he's some damn drunk. Then he takes a good look at him, the blood on his clothes. He looks over at the factory and sees maybe a dozen people, some of them lying on the ground, some of them just stumbling around, blood all over him, and he smells a smell, a funny, sweet smell, real strong, that kind of makes him dizzy just to breathe it. Thompson's no fool. He doesn't even get out of the car. He heads down the road, burns rubber up to the guard post, and has him wake up the adjutant. The adjutant turns a dead shade of pale when he hears the sheriff's story, but tells him not to worry, that they're keeping a few mental patients down by the factory and that he'll handle it. Well, I've known old Thompson a long time. He's like me. He can smell something fishy about a mile off. He goes back to town, wakes up his deputies, calls up the National Guard, and has a small army together when he heads back to the base. By this time, there's almost no way of keeping it under wraps. The adjutant, looking like he just wants to be somewhere else, drafts Thompson's men and the guard to help clean up the mess. That factory, Stahl paused, was making a new kind of nerve gas. Geez! Yep, Jesus and Mary too. They had a whole batch set the ship off to God knows where when there was a little fire and one of the big shipping canisters blew. They had mass, sure, but the stuff spread so fast that most of them didn't have time to get them on. Well, like I was saying, the adjutant got his men and us, I was there because I was on the guard, together. We had to wear full gas suits. One thing he told us, if we smelled cherries, to get the hell out of there. Cherries? Something, a recent memory, came to the back of Taylor's mind but did not quite surface. Cherries. The gas was scented with cherries so they could tell if it leaked. A lot of good it did 'em. When we went in, Stahl's voice had gone dry. When we went in, it was like a horror movie or one of those old paintings of hell. Some of them were still alive, all with blood all over them, theirs or somebody else's. They looked weird, some of them with those white lab suits. Some of them attacked us with knives, broken bottles, their teeth, and a few of us got hurt. But there weren't too many of them moving by then. I mean, the people working in that factory had gone plain nuts, went at each other with chairs, pencils, pipes they pulled off the walls. We found one guy disemboweled with a protractor. Stahl shook his head at the memory and grinned. Anyway, that's the sweet story of this place. They buried a few of the workers over there in that little woods, further side of the lot, behind where you're parked. County hassled the state until they made the army take away that factory, and the building had one of those mysterious fires not long after, burned it to the ground. The lot was vacant for a long time. Army sold off some land, and Coleman put in the depot here. Taylor's coffee had gone cold. He sipped it anyway to give his hand something to do. Surprised you haven't heard that story. No, said Taylor, but it's one of the damnedest tales I've ever heard. The story left him with an uneasy feeling, more than just the obvious horror of it. Something he couldn't pin down. He stood up and stretched, bumping the table with his knee. Automatically, he checked his watch. Thanks for the coffee and the yarn. Got to get back to the dispatcher. They'll be wondering what's happened to me. He picked up the shotgun and headed for the door. The metal door creaked as he opened it. Sure thing. You be careful out there, you hear? Taylor laughed and closed the door. After the warm, dry air of the office, the cold hit him like a wave, but it was stimulating. It helped him clear his mind of the thing that had been bugging him. The nerve gas had smelled like cherries, and the goddamn sweet smell that had gone along with the two bizarre incidents he had tonight had been, yes, the smell of cherries. But he told himself there was no connection. There could be no logical connection. He'd probably imagined the smell due to some odd mental association. It was the kind of thing that could weigh on a person's mind, if he let it. Before he went back to his car, Taylor walked behind the trailers to the rear of the lot and onto the small stand of cattails. Outside of a few broken stems from the shotgun blasts, there were no traces of the thing he had seen. Of course there weren't. On his way back, he checked out each of the trailers, but all were completely empty or closed, with their small aluminum door seals intact. He walked through the pale moonlight back to the old Chevy. He started the car and ran the engine for a while to get the heater up, then called in and took a mild chewing out from the dispatcher. He let the engine run until the car was good and hot, then settled back to watch the lot. A half hour later, the moon rose a little higher in the sky, a funny moon, near full, looking as if someone had just cut a thin sliver off the edge. He saw Stahl leave the terminal and drive away, and fought down the sudden sense of loneliness. An hour. He checked in. Everything 10-2, 10-4. Soon it was early morning. A faint trace of frost, unpleasantly like a face, etched across the window. Taylor started the engine, turned on the defroster, melted it away. He felt fairly confident that the trickster, whoever, had gone home for the night. Taylor slipped into a half-doze, the images of old girlfriends, each with their unique qualities, coming, as inevitably as they did, at this hour of the morning. He heard a train pass and perhaps did fall into a doze momentarily. Suddenly, he was wide awake. The wind had come up, the moon a shade higher. He saw something white, something large, winged, grotesque, shuffling across the parking lot toward his car. This was too much. His breath caught in his throat, and he sat frozen in his seat. He could only watch as it approached with the strange fluid motion. Suddenly, it rushed forward, leapt into the air, straight at the car. He found himself clutching the seat, looking at the open newspaper plastered across the windshield. The newspaper blew away. One thing about it he hadn't noticed. The date on the paper had been November 23rd, 1949. 32 years to the day. Taylor sighed and reached for the whiskey under the seat. This shift had gotten on his nerves a bit, but it would only be a couple of hours until dawn now. Then he heard the footsteps, running from behind him in the direction of the woods, coming quickly. He didn't even turn to look. Suddenly, he just wanted to be out of there. He turned the key in the ignition with the shaky hand, revved the engine a little. The footsteps came up on the passenger side. In the waning moonlight, he almost collapsed with relief. The face pressed to the car window was that of a young girl, a pretty young girl, smiling and shivering and pointing at the lock on the door. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. She tumbled into the seat with a shy laugh, bouncing up and down. She was maybe 19, with tousled black hair and bright dark eyes. Her cloth coat, loafers, and white knee socks seemed kind of dated, but this only added to her charm. "Brrr! Am I glad to see you? I never thought I'd find a way back to town." "Well," said Taylor, "I can't take you right back because I'm the security cop here tonight, but I can call in and have the dispatcher call you a cab. How would that be?" "Great! What happened? Car run out of gas?" She nodded, frowning. "I think so. Must have bumped my head or something when it stopped." She rubbed her forehead briskly. "Ouch! Yep, there's a bump all right." "Funny." Slowly she turned toward Taylor, a look of almost theatrical surprise on her face. "Yes, I kind of remember." Her voice went flat on remember, but he hardly noticed. This girl was pretty indeed. Maybe he could put off calling a cab for a while, say an hour or two. It wasn't long until dawn. She might like a little breakfast. She was quiet, watching him with an almost embarrassing intensity. Nervously, she pulled up those funny knee socks. He was not, he knew, entirely unattractive to women as far as that went. Then, for the first time, he consciously noticed her perfume. A very faint, sweet scent. Fruity. Cherries. Her face contorted, maniacal, teeth bared like a beast. Long, pointed nails streaking for his face. Cherries. Taylor screamed and lashed out. The impact of the blow flung her across the seat against the half-latched passenger door as he jammed the car into gear, still screaming. The Chevy spun in a full circle in the loose gravel as he fought to straighten it out, not realizing he had the gas pedal all the way to the floor. He was vaguely aware of the passenger door swinging open and slamming shut again as it crashed against a post going through the entrance. He didn't slow down until the state trooper racing beside him fired a shot across the hood. By that time, he was across the Ohio River and well into Kentucky. He pulled over and rolled down the window. Somewhere deep inside, a touch of rationality resurfaced, reminding him of the size of the fine he would well wind up paying if he stayed out of jail. Loss of money is always good for restoring sanity. The interior voice told him, gathering confidence, that he'd had one hell of a nightmare, a stupid, vivid nightmare, and that now he'd made a total ass of himself as a result. The trooper flashed his light around the front seat. "What's that gun doing there?" "I'm a security cop." "I'd hate to have you watching my place." He flashed his light back into Taylor's face. "Should have been a race car driver, buddy. If you're not sober, your ass is fried." The cop peered closer. "Say, what's that on your face? Jesus Christ. You been making out with a wildcat or what?" But Taylor, whose hand had lightly traced the crusted blood from the 5 deep scratches on his cheek, had fainted.